Welcome to the Working Tools Podcast, where today we will have part 2 of our discussion of Chapter 2 of Freemasons for Dummies, which we will begin with Speculative Masons and the Big Change.
Ladies and gentlemen, brethren all, welcome to the Working Tools Podcast, a casual conversation around Freemasonry. First, it's important to note that our thoughts and opinions are our own and do not reflect those of our Grand Lodge or respective craft or concordant bodies. Please connect with us and ask questions via our website at theworkingtoolspodcast.com.
Today on the Working Tools Podcast, we have our two-thirds of our usual hosts. I'm Matt Appel, and I'm a Mason from Mill Creek Lodge number 243 in Montlake Terrace, Washington. And we have very worshipful brother David Colbeth, who's actually the sitting master of King Solomon Lodge number 60 in Auburn, Washington. And we have our guest with us still, Craig Graham, who's a member of Kalamaka Lodge number 160 in Vernon, British Columbia, which I didn't look at my notes, so did I get that right, Craig?
Kalamalka, but there's a second L floating towards the end there, so it's named after a rather beautiful lake we've got in the area here. So
I apologize to the folks at Kalamalka Lake area. So yes, we left off right before. Well, in my book, it's on page 29, Speculative Masons and the Big Change. Which begins by talking about the influx of non-operative Masons into Masonic lodges in England, sort of again in the mid 1600s to early 1700s period, including such luminaries as the members of the Royal Society, Christopher Wren and them, and all sorts of important people of the era. This sort of jibed with, I guess, in my opinion, what I know of as Masonic history. Did you guys find anything particularly surprising, or is there an aspect of it that stood out to you?
Well, I guess to me, this is still one of the enduring mysteries. That these lodges that were around for a very, I trying hard to articulate what I'm thinking here, but the lodges that existed to provide employment for people of a certain trade, and all of a sudden, people that weren't really connected with that directly began I don't know what you say, attending or joining or becoming a part of, and Wren and those guys, they had the Royal Society, or they formed the Royal Society eventually, the coffee house culture was developing in Britain at that time, so people had the third spaces that they could go and discuss this type of thing. Why in particular did the Masons lodges form as or serve as a place where you could start? Why did we move from operative to speculative Masonry in Masonic lodges? That to me is one of the enduring mysteries, and it's something that we've never quite found an answer for. You hear the idea as well. They needed members to keep the lights on, so to speak, which is something we're still dealing with nowadays. Hodep doesn't really, he recognizes it in the chapter here, but there's not really a lot of idea about how why that happened. And to me, that's always a big question mark that's floated over this aspect of Freemasonry for me.
Yeah, the idea that the 1717 is the foundational date of Masonry. I mean, to some extent, and then you open this book and it says, well, the Regis manuscript was written in 1390, but then on the next page, the Templars were in 1100. So, where is the antiquity? Where did it really start? And I suppose it really kind of depends on your definition of what is it today's Freemasonry, or what Freemasons were when they began as stonemasons. So, there is this 100 or 200 years of flux that was happening in the 1600s and the 1700s that changed in some fashion, or what we can see from what he's written, that people were killing people to be in charge. And then there was an enlightenment period, and then they thought that this is the place to be. This is because they were the smart people. The Freemasons at the time were the smart people.
Well, Hodep himself mentions here in the chapter that you had, we talked about this in the last episode too, where you had a technological change. So now we've arrived at brick, which is something that can be, formed out of clay and other materials, fired on the spot, and then incorporated into a building. You're not having to quarry rock, perhaps at some very, very far distance away, and check it, number it, transport it over a long distance, and then incorporate it into a building. It allows for much quicker. It's like how we went from log cabins to light wood frame architecture in a few generations for much of the North American continent. And it's that's something that would have, obviously, if you were a trained mason at that time, you might have seen that as a real threat to your livelihood.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. And
Yeah.
and so when somebody that wants to join and that isn't an operative mason, that would have been very scary, or at least controversial, for sure.
Yeah, possibly. I guess what I would look at is that they already, even at that time, the operative masons had a long history of secrecy and keeping to themselves, and what was said in lodge stays in lodge. And so perhaps for people that were controversial in their own public lives or professions, it could serve as a place where they could get together and have discussions away from the limelight, or away from public notice. Well, that's, again, we clutch at straws here, or look for the ideas, because, like, as I said, these are things that are vitally important in our history. There's just not a lot there to support, how did we go from A through B to C to where we are today?
Yeah. Just for my 2 cents worth, I always figured that the local noble who was having his castle built or whatever, when the workmen all went off to have some secret meeting, he said, "What are you guys doing over there?" And they said, "Well, don't you worry about it." And he said, No, I want to be in on that meeting. I want to know what y'all are talking about." And then that's how anyway, in my head, that's how the first non-operative masons got in there, was by wanting to keep an eye on the operative masons. But that's, again, pure hypothesis on my part. I have no factual basis for that, obviously.
And maybe I'm missing. Did they really go off and create lodges, or was it just a group of the stonemasons that would hang together? Maybe they might go out drinking to the alehouse, or they would stay at, I would assume they'd have some kind of housing or lodging or something they would have to, when they're there for generations building these buildings. And so they just would get together and feast because they have common interests and they have the knowledge. It's certainly, I would imagine it's certainly not what we consider a lodge event or lodge meeting. It was much different. And my guess is it was just a social thing where they would get together and maybe discuss. I would imagine they didn't always discuss the Regis Manual at every event, or learn about it, but maybe they did.
There's my admittedly limited understanding is that they did form their lodges in the areas where the work was being done. And because I think it's in the Regis manuscript, there's talk of, like, if you miss a meeting, it'll be a shillings penalty and that sort of stuff. And there were meeting houses that maybe they didn't own them, but they had meeting spaces that they went to. And I think a lot of them were, whatever. It's where they also kept the plans, and where they had the tools and that sort of stuff that were there and available. So there were structures that were dedicated to the purpose, at least is my understanding. Again, not a Freemason during the 1500s, so I could be wrong.
But if you think about it from that perspective, what you actually have is a union hall.
Yeah,
exactly.
In a sense, at that point is a union hall, and there's a whole segue we could get into on how a lot of the organized labor movement took a lot. The early organized labor movement in North America took a lot of its structure from Freemasonry. There's especially in the railway craft unions, the engineers, the conductors, the brakemen, all formed. They were formed into lodges and orders, and I even found an old video on YouTube that showed the inside of a railway union meeting in the 1960s, and it was laid out something like a lodge, and there was some regalia that the guys were wearing, and it's quite fascinating. But that we, so possibly we went from an ancient craft union to a speculative social organization that formed the basis for labor unions down the in the 19th and 20th centuries. But I before we go too much further down that trail, I'll rein it in a bit. And to me, those ancient lodges that we talk about were more like a union hall than anything else. You perhaps had meetings once a week or once a month. You paid your dues. There was perhaps a rudimentary slate of officers that ran everything, and they would perhaps keep the agreement with whomever was paying for the cathedral work, be it the church or private subscription from a lord or a prince or a king or something, and that's sort of how we here got our start.
So you said you didn't want to go down this road, but I'm going to go down just a tiny bit further. My son is looking at colleges, and we were in Terre Haute, Indiana, a couple of weeks ago. And Terre Haute Lodge in Terre Haute, Indiana, has a beautiful lodge building. But they conferred the first and second degrees, but not the Master Mason degree, on Eugene V. Debs, who is a native of Terre Haute, Indiana, and a multi-time socialist candidate for president and big-time mover and shaker in was it the Pullman Railroad strike, I think? Yeah, anyway.
Would have been, yeah. Debs was well known for running for president from jail.
Exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was just an interesting little tidbit. I told my father that he was like, that guy, because my dad's big into railroads. But anyway, sorry, I've gone too far. So one of the things actually that David mentioned a minute ago was that he does talk about the Templar theory of Masonry, which was, well, I've read about it a couple of different places, but there was a book or two that came out about it. Was it John Robinson was his name? There was Born in Blood.
Born in Blood.
Yeah, and he sort of, I wouldn't say Chris Hodap poo-poos the idea, but he kind of makes it clear that, probably not. Is that your understanding of what he said too?
Yeah, I think he doesn't believe that that's a true historical account of it, but it's certainly writer's creativity allowance. But it is a good for a single page. This, not the book, but this little synopsis he has, a single page synopsis of Templars, is actually pretty good. I was impressed.
Yeah, I remember reading Born in Blood years ago, and a lot was hung on the fact that there was a guy whose name was Watt the Tyler was his name, and why would he be called the Tyler if it wasn't a Masonic lodge? Well, sure, I can think of another reason, but okay.
Yeah, I barely remember. I've got a copy of that book. I read it years ago. I don't really remember it well, but I do know that either in that book or another book on a similar topic, that there were photographs published in the book that had been taken in Scotland that seemed to show gravestones that had both Templar and operative type Masonic symbols on them. And then I think Robinson's thing was that this had supposedly been handed down in, because of course when the Templars were suppressed, the Scotland was actually, as a whole nation, was excommunicated from the Catholic Church. So the Templars found refuge there, and then of course they would have stayed, married into the local, eventually married into the local families. And so I think he believes that there's a series of families that perhaps this was passed down to. But I mean, if this is several hundred years from the suppression of the Templars to the rise of speculative Freemasonry in Scotland. So of course, people that had family history would, long ago in one would end up in the other. It doesn't necessarily mean that something secret was transmitted the whole way along.
Right. It makes for a good story, but I don't know that it makes for good history. All right. So that brings us kind of the founding of the first Grand Lodge. Are we there yet? 1717. So yeah, the 1717 four lodges got together and and formed the Grand Lodge of England, or there's actually the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster, I believe was the title of it when they formed it. And then it subsequently became, through a series of iterations and splittings and rejoinings and stuff, it is now the United Grand Lodge of England, as it is known, which is kind of, for those non-Masons who are listening, is kind of the
Claimed.
is the first among equals of Grand Lodges. I would say a lot of Grand Lodges sort of defer to the opinion of the UGLE in a lot of issues.
It's certainly interesting how throughout this whole chapter, there's a lot of proclamation. I'm now the one. My Grand Lodge is now the one. My rules are now the one. This is the way we're always going to do it. Oh, I'm going to kill you, and now I'm in charge. And there's certainly a lot of that happening, and so it's funny to and it's hard to follow. I almost wanted to get a big whiteboard and just draw that diagram out. Okay, they were married to him, and then he died, and then she was killed, and then now they're going to form Grand Lodges. Okay, that's a whole tear off the sheet and start over again.
Well, what I was going to say, though, is because we're part of a big conspiracy in this organization, you've actually got to do the thing where you put the pieces of paper up on the wall and then tie red string between them. Paul, that's the I think that's the more appropriate Masonic way of making a display like that. And then you bring people in and you say, "See this? Do you understand what I've been telling you for years and years?"
Torn out pages.
That's it. Things circled in red ink, and yeah, that's how you would do that. If that part of the book and that history is certainly tumultuous, because Horat mentions that the Grand Lodge, they formed themselves in 1717 and said, "We're here, we're it." And then he says right in his text, the Scottish and Irish Masons were like, "Well, no, we're not. You can take your ball and go home, because we're not going to, we're going to continue to do our own thing." Because even at that point, I think that speculative Masonry was actually quite widespread. I would ask you guys more, because you've read more on American Masonry than I have. By 1717, there was lodges well established in the U.S. in a number of places, wasn't there? I think even there's to the point where you had provincial Grand Lodges in some of the eastern states at that. Or, well, no, that wouldn't have been formed. But I mean, there was Masonry in the U.S. by 1717, wasn't there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Matt, you're muted.
Am I muted?
No, you're good. It was Matt.
I know that there were Masons in the U.S. and they were meeting. I'm willing to bet that if there weren't lodges, there were proto lodges of groups of Masons meeting that were maybe didn't have a charter or whatever, but had their own meetings and that sort of thing.
Okay.
I know the Grand Lodge of Pennsylvania claims to be the third oldest Grand Lodge in the world, and the oldest in the U.S. But apparently you can't say that in Ireland or Massachusetts or Virginia, because they'll fight you over it.
Okay.
But even though in 1717 they met and established the first Grand Lodge, the UGLE actually wasn't until 1813, right? That's what kind of confused me when I read that.
Right, yeah. Well, the UGLE was formed when the ancients and the moderns reunited.
Right.
In 1813, after there was the Grand Lodge of York, and that was a whole separate thing. And then there was the Grand Lodge of England, which had a schism from the ancients and the moderns.
Yes.
Yeah.
And later I don't want to jump ahead, but yeah, to your point, there was in 1730, he talks about later that's when the first lodges were in Philadelphia, Boston. So there was already Masonic movement happening in the early 1700s. And so who's to say when really things really were getting together? Just because they organized in 1717 in a tavern doesn't mean that there wasn't already organized Masonry in the United States or the colonies at the time.
Yeah, there may have also. I'm not sure if this is a little early, but they that you also had military Freemasonry as well. You actually had as the Grand Lodges were formed in Britain, they would actually issue warrants to lodges that were contained within military regiments, and those lodges just simply traveled where wherever that particular regiment or battalion was. I might be again jumping just a little bit ahead. Yeah,
it's all right. Yeah, but, there's nothing. I've never read anything or seen anything. Were there any Masons on any of the initial Columbus's voyages? There's no comments about that. I can't imagine there wouldn't have been.
No, but that's so what year was so
That's the
Columbus?
late 1400s. That's pretty early
Yeah,
on.
yeah,
And they were
like 'cause
Catholic, so they might not have been too enthusiastic.
Uh, maybe, maybe.
See, now you're going down the Templar road there. Yep.
I mean, weren't they the Protestants trying to flee from the oppression?
no, that was
Well,
that was a few decades later when you had the Puritans coming over to
Okay.
New England, and I don't think there were too many Freemasons among them either. So it's I think it was sort of a little more osmotic how we ended up on this continent, but I can't be. It's again, things that are lost, in the mists of history, and we allow the internet and fiction writers to kind of pick up the necessary space there.
I suppose they didn't build much out of stone. It was all out of trees. So they obviously didn't have a whole lot of
No.
in the beginning. Well, is this a good point to
yeah, I
hold
think
up, or are
we're
we?
maybe a little shorter than our usual episode, but it does seem like we've reached a natural breaking point.
There's so much in this chapter.
There really is. Essentially, I mean, we've set out to discuss all of Masonic history, so it's a it's tough to contain.
It did take us a little longer than 30 minutes, didn't it?
Yeah.
So, and we haven't even talked about France yet. So, wait till we get to France.
Oh yeah. And as a good Presbyterian, I will say that the James Anderson, who wrote the Anderson's Constitution, was apparently a Presbyterian minister. I learned that in my reading. So there you go. 17, whatever that was, 23 or something like that. That was strike a blow for the Presbyterians.
Yes.
So, then you were about to say something, David? I'm sorry.
No, I just was agreeing with you. Yes, I didn't know that either. I didn't know that about him either. I can't claim to be a Presbyterian, but it was interesting to learn that.
Well,
I think
as an Anglican, I just have to say that I've just, part of a vast group of people that belong to the English Grand Lodge, the English lodges. So that, and a lot of there's more than a few places in Canada where Masonic lodges are held in Anglican churches. So it's interesting when we don't discuss religion, but it still comes up as a topic in our conversation.
our lodge actually briefly talked about moving to a church not too long ago, but yeah, we didn't do it.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, with that, I think we're wrapping up our conversation I think we're maybe a third of the way now into chapter 2 of the Freemasons for Dummies book. As always, we're happy to hear your thoughts on the topic. If you want to contact us through the various media on which we appear. And on behalf of David and Craig and the absent Stephen, we want to thank you all for listening to our humble podcast and wish you a good night. Goodbye.